No mistakes. As we sit tucked away in the ancient central Pangaean mountain range, we'd like to offer you a warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias, to our humble podcast, Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. This is our, well, not quite first ever live show, as this is now officially part 2, but we were recording this back to back, so it still is on Facebook until we hit the first ad break. It's being broadcasted just to Facebook this time, as we've ended the Instagram feed. We're usually a family-friendly podcast. We'll tell you when we aren't before the episode starts. In this podcast, we theorize the fourth dimension exists and is the spiritual dimension.
Here, we're dedicated to pushing science, logic, and the Socratic method to their limits as we discuss the mysteries and mythologies of the world.
The only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so this episode is indeed family-friendly. But if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, you should probably turn off the podcast right about now.
So we were going to do a fish fact, but Josiah's got a little
bug
fact for us.
Yeah, so carpenter bees, you can tell whether they're male or female because the males have a smaller head with a white square on the face, and the females just have a little bit larger of a black head. There's your etymology fact instead of fish fact for the day.
Okay.
All right, so joining us today, once again, we have Colonel Mastriano. I've listed all of his credentials in the previous episode. He has a PhD in history, 4 master's degree, 4 different deployments. I'm doing this mostly off of memory here, just hitting the highlights. Taught at the U.S. Army War College. He's published 3 books, 50-plus articles. The list goes on. He's also, in one of his books, he did archaeological research for it, field research, and book research. So, as we nodded to in the last episode with Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, he did indeed get out of the library and do some good field research. And he wrote a whole book about that. So, yes, that being said, we didn't hit in this last episode. Where can people find you if they're listening to our podcast? You're bringing more listeners and viewers than we are right now, but if people are hearing everything we're talking about on here from our podcast side and they want to find you, where can they find information about you?
At Twitter, at Doug Mastriano, Facebook, Doug Mastriano, Fighting for Freedom.
Awesome. And I will say our guest here is a political figure. We're not going to say what side of the spectrum he is on. We show respect to both sides. Here on the show, we are apolitical. Just want to say that, for our listeners that know the ground rules of the podcast, if you're looking up this guest, you will see things on one side of the political spectrum versus the other. We're apolitical here, Trace and I. We don't get involved in politics. I believe that the word politics is derivative of the Greek poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking creatures. So I respect you for being in the field and being able to survive in the field of backstabbing politics. So with that being said, we're going to continue our conversation from last episode. You built us a stool with 2 legs, Colonel. Give us the third leg here so that this stool doesn't fall over.
So a logical Greek-styled approach is this the way I'm trained, based off of my argument for the veracity of the Old and New Testaments. The first leg, of course, was closeness of the sources to the event, and I demonstrated such as with this famous St. John parchment, near contemporary document, that you could verify portions of John chapter 18 of the gospel. Then the second part was outside contemporary sources, where we went through a whole bunch of contemporary and near contemporary Roman and Greek historians talking about, alluding to, or describing events of Jesus or the Christians, confirming much of what's written in the New Testament. And then the last, of course, is archaeological evidence.
And for those of you that are just listening in, the banging around that you heard, he does actually have a specific copy of these fragments of the Gospel of John, chapter 18, from the original Greek. I'm actually holding them in my hands right now. Trace, you want to hold it? Feel cool?
Sure, I'll hold it.
There you go. So he indeed has a specific copy he's able to show on the live. But yeah, people can look that up and find it as well. Is there a specific like a P60 something number for that specific papyrus that they have, so people are curious to which one we're referring to?
I'd have to look at the document here.
I'll skim through it real quick and you can start building the third leg, and I'll just chime in when I got it.
Okay. So the third leg is archaeological, and that I would say in many ways that this is the most important, because this is tangible physical evidence that that either confirms or denies an assertion, a topic, an issue. For about a century or so, historians and theologians believe that. Did you find it?
Yes, it's for those of you that want to look it up. It's P52, and that's a general format you see for most papyri, I guess is what it's called, that are recovered, is that they'll be P in some number because historians are very, very high speed and they have a very complex system. So P is for papyrus and then a number.
Not to be confused with the B52 bomba.
Yes, P papa 52.
So archaeological evidence, and so as I said, there were people up until 1917 that thought that the existence of the city of Babylon, so much described in the Old and New Testaments, was just a fictitious location, didn't exist. There was no evidence of it existing until the British in World War I were fighting the Ottoman Turks that had an empire that extended through modern day Kuwait and Iraq, and this British officer was like, "What are all those mounds over there?" And his men were bored, so he had them start digging. And guess what? He found Babylon. And so that discounted 1,000 years or so of revisionist history, just trying to discount the Bible as not being reliable because, hey, we have no evidence of Babylon. Well, when you start digging, you find the truth. And, this is not really subject to interpretation. We're talking about material, a hard fact, of documents, of buildings, etc. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, what do you do with the information? And so we're facing a lot of revisionism in America. So since John Pope, English poet, cited him in the last episode, around 1710, he said, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing." And that's our problem today. We have people that watch, they see a 30-second video on TikTok or something, and they're, wow, that must be, and they run off, with a little knowledge and saying big things about it. John Pope says a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And then he goes on to say, drink deep of the springs of Perea, the springs of wisdom in ancient Greece. So if you hear something, it intrigues you, dive down deeper, which your program here is doing. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the revisionism that has really corrupted people's understanding. So I laid out this.
Can I pause you real quick? Let's give you a little bit of validity here because you've actually firsthand been the recipient of some of this revisionist history on a much more recent time scale with your research. We'll kind of allude to what we'll talk about in a little bit here with Sergeant York. And people were trying to claim that what was supposedly happened in the accounts didn't actually happen, and that bothered you. So you went out and you did both library research in the original fractoral German, because you speak German and you can read German very well, very fluently, being an exchange student over there and all that. And then you also went out and did field research with permission from the French local authorities to try to locate where everything happened. And we'll talk more. I don't want to get into that too much now, but I just want to do a nod here to say that this revisionist history, this is nothing new. This has been going on for several decades at least. Social media has exacerbated it. It's really blown it out of proportion from what it is, where all of these people that didn't have a platform because of their lack of credentials and their atrocious, outrageous, poorly researched claims, they now have platforms to say all these things. And I think that's I'm not saying that in and of itself is an issue, but you have to understand that that's what social media is. It gives anyone a platform that can say atrocious things that are wildly inaccurate, and you have to go do your own research or you're going to be deceived. So you've been a recipient of this. You've fought this on a specific issue as recent as just at the time under 100 years ago, 90 years after an event. You went in and defended something that happened and actually proved what was true and what was false. So that being said, I wouldn't say you're an expert in all these areas from that, of course, but you definitely are a very, very specified individual to bring onto this podcast to talk about this revisionist history.
And you're right. So, you can say Sergeant York was in my lifetime because I was born in 1964 and he passed away in 1964. That was physically in my lifetime. And so even with people in the lifetime with firsthand knowledge, that we'd face higher criticism, a reinterpretation of the events. And so my approach in this, now I didn't go out to prove it was being so. I went out to see if it was so, mm-hmm. as we know.
As you should, yes.
So, the other side, it was kind of like, Indiana Jones on our side here, and you were part of the team. And of course, the other team was Belloc, Beloche, working for the Germans. And the other team was working off of just the American account because they didn't come to Germany. They didn't go to the German archives. It wasn't available online. And so I was able to get the whole account from both the American perspective, which took a lot of effort, and the German perspective, which was an immense effort, a lot of time. And as you said, much of it is written in Fraktur. That's bad enough. Americans call it Gothic writing. It's called Fraktur, actually. So when you're thinking Gothic writing, Fraktur. But then in cursive, the fraktur was even harder to read. So we had, Annalisa, our German grandmother over there, kind of adopted us, friends with the family. She would be the one to read the letters to me because I couldn't read the cursive fraktur. It's a completely different language in its writing. And so, with that, we go to higher criticism here. And I don't know if you want to go right into this.
Well, I don't want to derail you from your whole flow here because I know you have a whole framework you're trying to operate off of, and you're going to build us the third leg. So tell you what, let's do the third leg of your argument first, then we'll move into talking about higher criticism, then we'll talk about side. I think that'll be a good flow for us.
Well, actually, let's jump into higher criticism because it's a segue into my archaeological. So there was a doctor, and I'm going to say it in German, but I'll do it in English. I'll say it's Dr. Julius Wellhausen. He passed away in 1918, and he was one of the leading professor of theologies of the Old Testament in Göttingen, as well as Greifswald, Halle, and Marburg. So he was this big professor muckety-muck in Germany at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s. And basically, he came up with this idea called higher criticism. He goes, we don't have any archaeological evidence here to demonstrate that the Bible's reliable. And he also believed that it was not a reliable source because he believed that the first 5 books of the Bible were not written by Moses, but was really basically Jewish propaganda or remembrances from their captivity in Babylon, trying to create a history and tradition for the Jewish people to survive while being exiled in Babylon, having been captured by the Babylonians and carried off into exile, which did happen. So he didn't view the Bible as actually factual, but was looking for a spiritual double meaning behind these writings. And that higher criticism ideology still exists in our seminaries today. This is why we have so many, pastors and others that have graduated from Bible college, but they're critics, they're skeptics, and they've been influenced by this higher criticism. But at its root, Julius Wellhausen, his whole idea is baseless, and so we have these schools to this day still teaching his propaganda, and it was completely disproven in 1979 during an archaeological dig led by archaeologist Gabriel Barkay. One of and like digs do, like we did, you bring kids on board because the kids are free. This is not unprofessional. Kids come on and they work hard. They're free. All you have to do is feed them.
Sounds a lot like child labor there.
Oh, in that case, I was very much labored as a child because I went to all but 5 of our side archaeological digs. But please continue.
So archaeologist Gabriel Barkay, he had one young kid with him. His name was Ian Stern. I actually met Ian Stern on my last trip to Israel. And he's very enthusiastic about archaeology, as you can imagine, because he's been doing it as a kid, like you were. And so at the Kadif Hinnon dig, it was low budget, as most digs tend to be. And he had a big group of young kids around 12 or 13 years old that he hired on. It was just outside of Jerusalem on a Jerusalem road to Bethlehem, a historic road, by the way. And higher criticism says, okay, Daniel, basically, the first 5 books of the Old Testament were not written by Moses, but a Jewish propaganda written, 1,500 years after Moses, and it was just to create an identity to keep the Jewish people alive, united. Well, that was completely disproven during this dig by a 13-year-old kid that I mentioned this guy Ian that I worked with. I asked him after his presentation, do you remember Nathan? The kid that was always going to, he goes, oh, I remember him, of course, because he was the same age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so this 13-year-old kid, Nathan, finds one of the most important biblical artifacts. He completely destroys Julius Wellhausen's higher criticism. And so here's what the archaeologist Gabriel Barkay said in Jerusalem about this kid, Nathan. Among the 13-year-old diggers, there was one annoying kid named Nathan who was always tugging at my shirt. This is before they gave medicines to young boys.
Like Trace has been on medication. Trace, this kid is basically you, just in a different life.
So among the 13-year-old diggers, there was one annoying kid named Nathan who was always tugging at my shirt. This is a quote from Gabriel Barkay, by the way. I thought this was an ideal place to put him. Gabriel Barkay said, go over there and clean up these steps that we found. So he would be out of my way. I told Nathan... So it was a repository they found by the steps. They had to be as clean as a mother's kitchen, even if he had to lick it. And so Nathan cleaned up the repository that they recently uncovered, but he had a hammer in his hand. So he started banging on the rocks and the steps with a hammer, and he cracked open a crypt. And they didn't know this crypt existed. And inside the crypt, they found an amulet, a silver amulet with part of the Old Testament in it. and it predates the exile to Babylon.
Wow.
Higher criticism is a fraud. Julius Wellhausen is a fraud.
And this is what you would say Billy Carson's argument is largely built off of, right? Which is the whole the Bible is a copy from the older Sumerian texts. And so this is a very clear disproof from the 1970s, before Billy Carson even became a thing, became popular, that disproved his whole premise.
A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So he was exposed in some way to Julius Wellhausen's higher criticism, which is still being taught today, and it's completely disproven by this single find. And there's been more finds since, but the silver amulet. So it was this amulet in silver, rolled up with parts of Deuteronomy, written on it. And it's like, whoa, we have a problem here, Houston. Yeah, no kidding. So higher criticism, it should not be taught in seminary because it's based off a whole fraudulent scheme.
That's wild, because you look at how much Sumerian and Babylon have tied together, and those trace back very clearly with tales like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we have a Babylonian and we have Sumerian versions of the epic that we're able to reference. And I know this because I've been researching this for our upcoming show after UFOs, talking about this. But that's wild then, because then you have to acknowledge that the Bible came to all of its conclusions at least pre-Babylonian that we see in Genesis.
Yes.
It's at least pre-Babylonian, likely pre-Sumerian at this point then, because that was the initial thought premise here, and we know that Sumerian and Babylon are built off of each other. That's wild to me, because then we have confirmation looking at this comparative myth topic that these are coming from different angles, and it's super cool, because then it gives us, that answers the question, because a lot of question you'll see with comparative myth is, is it actually independent source, or are these just based off of each other at different points? And I've seen arguments saying that the Iliad and the Epic of Gilgamesh are similar enough that there's theorizations they would have been passed along via trade routes. These stories would have been retold, and that the Iliad is just the Greek version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have yet to delve into that deeply, but that's just some premises I've seen put forward in some of my research. So, Trace, what do you have? And then we need to take an ad break.
I have a couple of questions here. So why do you think they still teach it, even though it's been disproven like this? I mean, is it just a bias going around?
Yeah, I do think it's a bias. I think one thing, it's academic laziness, not keeping up with the archaeology. And this is 1979. So,
yeah.
I mean, really, guys? And then, has there been more to demonstrate that the first 5 books of Pentateuch were written by Moses, that predate Babylon? And yes, there's been a lot more since then. So one is laziness. I think number 2 is just generally an agenda to discredit the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Christian college, and I was surprised that the theology teachers were actually more cynical and critical of the Bible than bringing out the evidence that would support it. And so I even saw that bias, and I was kind of thinking, I went on a scholarship, only thinking, why is my scholarship spending so much money on this education when I get the same one at a state-run school?
Yeah.
Just as cynical and critical. It really bothered me. Just give me the facts. I don't need propaganda, but discuss the silver. I found out about the silver amulet on my own. Why wasn't that taught to us? It was only a few years after the find. Why didn't that professor bring it in? That's just sheer laziness and dishonesty.
Yeah, that's disingenuous intellectually and academically, or just plain ignorance of not knowing about the find because of lack of interest to do the research. And we've definitely talked about this on the show, Trace, you and I, about how there's an agenda being pushed forward with the standard model, and that people are being taught what to think and not how to think in most public schools. And that's not a comment from you in any regards. This is Trace and mine comments actually from another podcast, and we have agreed with it, is that people are taught what to think and not how to think. And that's a problem, because a lot of the things that are being put forward have holes in them that warrant you asking questions, but it gets poo-pooed and you get identified as being unscientific if you ask questions.
Yeah. Could it also be kind of a lack of getting that information out there? Because I think that's another thing, is trying to communicate that, hey, we found this. So could it just been a lack of communication on their part too?
So even back then, there was a magazine called Biblical Archaeology, I think it was called. And so the evidence was out there.
Okay.
They just had to subscribe to that magazine. Obviously, back then you had to actually, pay for a subscription.
Yeah.
There's no Google or Chat GPT.
Nope. But it was available. So another thing here, building the archaeology. So the Pentateuch was not exile propaganda, in the aftermath of Nebuchadnezzar conquering, Israel and conquering the Judeans off to modern day Iraq. Babylon did exist, and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written well before, because even for Julius Wellhausen to say that from his comfort in Göttingen, Germany, obviously he clearly did not travel to the Holy Land, because where exactly in the Pentateuch do you see any Sumerian or Babylonian influence on writing? There's zero.
Yeah. You don't see indications to like Tiamat or any of the other deities. It's like it's their own creation and spin on it at the very least, even if you want to say the Bible's fully made up in its account in Genesis.
So is that how they date it? Is they just see like there's not really any influence in here?
I mean, that's just one thing that I threw it out there as far as that's one thing I put out there simply because of the writing. If it was Babylonian exile propaganda, why don't we see any Babylonian or Sumerian prose or inferences? Our view of and approach to history today is based off the scientific method, which is rooted in the Greek method going way back. And the scientific method, of course, came up during the Enlightenment, and so I'm of the science that the scientific method has influenced my approach to history, as it does most historians. So I'm saying I'm influenced by our society and our society's way of thinking and approaching, but we don't see any Babylonian Sumerian influence in the Pentateuch. It's very distinct. It's very focused on Israel, on Moses. The dimensions of the temple are in there, and the tabernacle. I mean, sometimes it's kind of hard to read because this vessel here will be made of this material and this 1 cubit long and have this dimension. And I don't see anything like that in Sumerian writing. It's just bizarre. So Julius Wellhausen was being very biased. There's some reason he wanted to demonstrate that he didn't believe what was written and was trying to discount it as something spiritual. And then, even in his lifetime, he passed away in 1918. When the British Army was marching across modern-day Iraq fighting the Ottomans, Babylon was discovered, and it was a big deal that this field marshal was like, "Wow, we found Babylon!" And it's still, even on his dying bed, he refused to recant. His whole life's work was a fraud.
Wow.
I mean, that would be kind of hard to go back and say, "Oh yeah, my entire life's work was wrong."
I mean, it's hard, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
That being said, I hate to put a pause in this conversation. We're going to have to, though. But I'll finish it out with this thought. It's like we say on the show nearly every episode. Those of you with confirmation bias, you will find what you're looking for. It's inevitable. We'll be right back after this brief ad break.
All right, we are back. So I asked a question about the dating methods on the amulet and just that kind of stuff. So pass it over to you.
Yeah, so the silver amulet found in 1979 because of the shenanigans of a 13-year-old aspiring archaeologist, so ADD probably. His name was Nathan. The archaeologist that I mentioned before, Ian, was one of the kids on the dig, but now he's an adult and pretty well-known archaeologist in Israel. So as to the dating for a historical and archaeological method, they would look at where it was discovered. Was it contaminated? Could have been dropped in there beforehand. And according to archaeologist Barkai, no, it was a sealed chamber. And in there were other collaborating pieces of archaeological evidence that would suggest that his identification was accurate as far as predating the Dead Sea Scrolls by 400 years. So this would be several hundred years before the exile, completely disproving the whole. Just one find would disprove an entire thing still taught in American seminaries across the world, compromising, undermining people's belief in the veracity of the Bible.
Now, do you have a specific slide on this?
So I do. It's with Nathan in the silver amulet next to him, and the kids laying around on the top of the crypt.
All right, I'll just put that in from the ad break.
And you have to go to the notes to see this, and this is where I delineate what he found. So within this chamber here, Dr. Barkai says there was a lot of excitement, thanks to Nathan banging his hammer around. In one chamber, there was more than 1,000 artifacts that included 125 objects of silver, 40 iron arrowheads, and these weapons of war, you could tell from what period they're from, as well as the other artifacts and how they're arranged or displayed. It included gold, ivory, glass, bone, 150 semi-precious stones. This particular chamber was 2 feet of accumulation filled with objects and skeletal remains, and there was a lot of dust and a lack of oxygen. It was very hot. We had to change teams every few hours. And he goes on to describe more of the concept here.
So sound methodology via other artifacts in the cave is basically what it boils down to.
Yeah, so what they found, first, was it compromised? No, it was a sealed chamber, and secondly, the artifacts found with it would confirm the time that he estimated that the silver amulet would be inscribed upon.
It's a great question, Trace. I appreciate that. So we're still exploring higher criticism, yes, or are you wanting to bounce back to your third leg of the stool?
So the third leg is archaeologically, and then I would say that is so important because if you don't have concrete evidence, and then it would bring a natural rise, which would explain the criticism that Babylon was symbolic. Christians in the 18 and 1900s, early 1900s, believed was symbolic until the British Army uncovered Babylon. And it's a fact. It existed, and the evidence was there. It was just waiting to be found. So I'd mentioned before, some of these higher critics also, they want to scrutinize and question every aspect of the Bible. And so there was a group of these, up until recently, saying that Pontius Pilate was a fictitious creature, did not exist. He was a fiction, to make an anti-hero in the New Testament kind of thing. He's, of course, the governor of Judea by the Romans during the time of Jesus. And because there was no evidence archaeologically of him, they'd say, but they would ignore the ancient writers like Talis and others that mentioned the existence. So these are people are operating ignorantly. They're discounting near contemporary writings about him, which would be enough. For Caesar, it's enough.
Mm-hmm.
For Thucydides, it's enough. But for the Bible, it's not. And so, Pontius Pilate was just symbolic. He didn't exist. Well, and you saw this in 1961 in Caesarea. They found a stone with Pontius Pilate's name inscribed upon it in a city where Pontius Pilate mostly lived for 10 years, from 26 AD to 36 AD. And on there, the inscription says, it was a stone dedicating a temple in Caesarea to Tiberius, one of the greatest Caesars of the time. And it says, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, drop mic.
And I'll apologize to our YouTube watchers as you're seeing a very awkward picture of me from 13, 14 years old right about now. For those of you on Spotify platform, other podcasting platforms, I'm very glad you're missing seeing that photo of me because I have a very cheesy pose.
Go to YouTube photo. Right now.
Right now. Timestamps right around 27 minutes and you'll see it. But yeah. So, you see this pretty commonly in the historical spheres, though, where that was the same thing with Troy, right? Where they thought that Troy was a fabrication. It was a creation of myth by the Greeks until someone used terrain association of what was laid out in the Iliad, which literally means the story of Troy, correct?
Yes.
And they used terrain association to be like, okay, where would this city be? Let's do an archaeological dig right about here. And sure enough, Troy is found. And we still consider things like Atlantis to be fictitious. It's a bit ludicrous to me that we're so quick to believe the myths of science, and we're so hesitant to believe the stories passed down to us from our ancestors. It just kind of blows my mind a little bit. What do you think, Trace?
Oh, yeah. I think with so many instances of us finding out, oh, hey, this myth turns out it's true. I think with so many instances, we got to look at myth a little different now and say, okay, well, let's dive into a little more and figure out if it is true or if it isn't, if it's an exaggeration or something along the lines of that.
Yeah, it's not an absolute proof or disproof. It's just hey, maybe we should look into this a little bit more. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss it, since time and time again, there's been aspects to myth. And then that begs the question of what is myth and what is true? Mm-hmm. Because then myth claims some pretty wild things in terms of like the demigods. If they were real, that's a whole different story, which when you read Genesis 6, that seems to be the direction that passage is going, is saying something like demigods existed on the earth. So you've got to wonder what happened. And this kind of nods a little bit to the question from our viewer last episode that was watching on Instagram, asking about if the past history is being hidden. And I think that there is just a general disbelief to these more outrageous claims from history, and they just get flat out ignored.
Well, so we talk about Pontius Pilate here, and what's interesting is, once again, these higher critics, of course, wanted to say, well, he didn't exist because we have no evidence, but then they ignore the writings of Talis. I read his writing. It's like an account from the gospel. He was not a Christian, 55 AD, actually contemporary of the Christians and Jesus, and he described what happened during the crucifixion and death of Jesus, and it looked like the biblical account, which hadn't been published yet as far as in 55 AD. I don't think so. So he's basing off of his research and what he heard from contacts in Judea that, wow, when we crucified Jesus, the sun was blacked out. Tallis also discusses in his histories the fall of Troy. And so these people have said, oh, Troy is just a myth and all that. They're ignoring the ancient writers, much as you alluded to with perhaps maybe even with Atlantis. So you have, the writings there until you stumble upon the archaeology. It's easy for people to say, well, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So before we jump to conclusions, and that's ad hoc ergo propter hoc logical fallacies, jumping to conclusions because of this, that, I would say sit down and say, are there sources, near contemporary or contemporary sources here, to discuss the circumstance or person? So we have had other historians talk about Pontius Pilate, despite that seminaries want to say he was, a symbolic figure, didn't exist. Well, guess what? Archaeology says differently. And by the way, many ancient Roman historians wrote about him, not just with Tallis. There was others. So we have also now the high priest of course, that wanted Jesus crucified and handed him over to the Romans. Under Roman law, the Jews could not kill anybody. That was left up to those enforcing civil law, the Romans, which had been there since, I think, 70 BC when Pompey came in and worked a deal to intervene to help the Jews during their civil war, and they stayed.
Pompey the general, yes. Not the location. Also, can you explain contemporary and non-contemporary for us?
So contemporary would be somebody who's actually alive when the person or event or situation he's writing about. Near contemporary would be a few years, beyond that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Trace, anything to add? Any other questions there?
No, I was going to ask the contemporary thing too.
Oh, okay, great. So we're on the same wavelength there. Yeah, I just figured that's good clarity.
So Caiaphas, big, huge historical find here from archaeological perspective, just earth-shaking. My last visit to Israel, they took us to Caiaphas' house. They had the evidence that it was his house. It's a very prestigious house in the old part of the city. It's like in somebody's basement now because the city's built upon, the Romans destroying the city. Layers.
That's a pretty common thing for ancients, is that there's ruins built on top of ruins built on top of ruins.
So I saw Caiaphas' house. I saw this ritual baths that he and his family would have used. There was strict purification. Us Gentiles, non-Jews, didn't figure out sanitation until Louis Pasteur in the 1870s. Germ theory. Well, the Jews, had they abided, if the guidance of God gave the Jews 2,000-3,000 BC was about cleanliness, so to prevent the spread of disease, unbeknownst to them, and not until we figured out why there was a method to this, physically.
Yeah.
So we have Caiaphas. We have the actual stairs that Jesus and Caiaphas would have walked up to going into the old city of Jerusalem. We were there. I have a picture of that there with the stairs, the processional stairs the psalmist used to use. There's a picture, of course, Rebbe on the original stairs outside a second temple. Millions of sandals would have put their feet on those steps there, and this is things described in the context of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So one more vignette I want to use, of course, is we wanted to visit Israel. On our first visit there, you were there with. We want to go from Dan to Beersheba, and that's a term used in the Old Testament that you saw all of Israel. If you go from the city of Dan to Beersheba, Dan in the north by the headwaters of Jordan, and by the high ground like Mount Hermon, or down south in the desert, Beersheba, where actually Abraham dug a well. And so in the city of Dan, I was intrigued. It's a beautiful historic archaeological site. And there's a picture of Josiah standing on the walls of Dan there, rough stone walls, round stones they piled on top of each other with a mortar in between. But the next slide here, there's a quote from describing Dan, the city of Dan, 2 Kings 23:8. And the king Josiah, not the Josiah city, Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the high priest had burned incense. And he broke down the gateway at the entrance at the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which was on the left of the city gate. So he's in the city of Dan, and he says to the left side of the city gate, there was a high place, a place where they do worship. And guess what? On the left side of the city gate is the high place they found.
That's wild. And it's like... It's almost anecdotal to a sense, almost, not quite, but it's just a little minuscule detail like that. And it's like, to get that detail right, if the Old Testament, if the king's account was made up, you can't make up little details like that. You can't. It's not possible to do that for an account like that. So you are faced with the reality that this account has to be true, at least in some capacity. Even if you don't want to accept it completely, there's no reason to question it historically.
So. That's okay. That's one thing. So who would put a random thing like there's a small altar, a high place, where as you go into the city gate, you'd offer some kind of sacrifice or incense, what have you. Who would include that kind of detail unless it wasn't so? But if that's not enough, Dan is not just one off. They talk about at 2 Samuel 19. They speak about where the king would sit at the gate, and there's the judgment seat is at the gate as described in 2 Samuel. Okay, let's get another one here. I go into the quotes from 1 King 12, where Jeroboam, who became the first king of Israel, there's a rift between the southern kingdom and northern kingdom. Jeroboam thought to himself, now Jerusalem is in Judea, the tribe of Judah. And Jeroboam, when he broke off with the other 10 tribes, the priestly tribe, he was afraid that if people continued to worship in Jerusalem, that his kingdom would no longer exist. So he's like, let me build a replica in the city of Dan, an alternate place to worship rather than Jerusalem. And you walk into the city gate there, and guess what? There's a replica of the inner gate of the worship place of the shrine of for the temple of Jerusalem, also in Dan. You could see it yourself.
Yeah, it's all right there, all the evidence, and it's really hard to fabricate these kind of little details. And we'll get into some more of these shortly here, because I'm going to go on a rant about a supposed contradiction from the New Testament that's come to my attention from, again, the logical fallacy ridden account reasoned reality, which they really need to change their name. Unreasoned fallacies would be more accurate. Trace, you got anything to add here? I think we'll take a quick ad break and collect ourselves.
The only thing I can think of is that I think this only validates the Bible as being as a historical document, which is a good thing to validate. But I think if you're still going to argue against all the stories and the religious aspects of it, you can still say that, okay, well, maybe they put these accurate details in there, but then they still made up the stories surrounding the details. So what...
I mean, you're faced with a challenge then, because like we talked about with the account from the Roman historian in the last episode, where they got the details right about Jesus's crucifixion and the earthquake and all those other things happening. So you see these threads. Now, that's not necessarily an absolute proof for everything, but you see these threads there where these wild claims that the Bible's making in terms of miracles do seem to be validated to some degree. Now, again, we've stated on the show countless times, we're not going to force you to believe anything. That's not the premise of the show. It's not. We sometimes dive a little bit into the theological aspects, because right now we're analyzing the Bible and we're broadening our perspectives to look at the historical validity of texts in general. That requires a little bit of theology. But our intent in the show is not to push Christianity down anyone's throats to make you believe anything that you don't want to believe. That is a personal choice. We're just laying out the evidence for you to analyze yourself, or to critique the methods of, and to send us your thoughts if you have any. That being said, we're going to take a real quick ad break, and we'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, historians, quantum historians, quantumly entangled historians. We invite you to quantumly transcend time and email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. Seeing as the guest here is my father, very easy to have him on for a future show if there's a lot of valid questions that come our way. So, Colonel, over to you. What you have a couple of things left to build your third leg of your stool here, so we'll let you finish your carpentry project.
Thank you. Carpentry, very appropriate for a discussion on Jesus, perhaps.
That's true, yes.
So, the first leg was sources, how close to the event did they exist? And we demonstrated that we have sources, on top of the event, Talus, for instance, Greek and Roman historians. And then the second leg, of course, was, do the other non-associated historians, bring out, did they collaborate? Yes, they do. And the last leg, and I'd say the strongest leg, is from my perspective, is archaeology. Because I'm a tacky turn. I like to touch stuff and look at stuff. And so, I mentioned higher criticism wants to say, that Babylon didn't exist, and well, guess what? It did. World War I brought it out. It's a fact. Babylon did exist. So higher criticism, you're wrong. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were not written by Moses, but by, it's Jewish propaganda during the exile after Nebuchadnezzar carried off the people of Israel, the children of Israel, to modern-day Iraq, Mesopotamia. Well, guess what? The silver amulet alone, discovered in 1979, disproved that entire hypothesis. And then, of course, higher critics went after Pontius Pilate. And guess what? We had plenty of evidence he existed. So it's insane to me they even questioned that he existed based off of what Greek and Roman historians mentioned him by name as a prefect of Judea. But then you want evidence? 1961, and we have a picture of the stone with his name on it in Caesarea, where his capital was, where he ruled from most of the time. Yeah, he rode into Jerusalem, but he ruled mostly from Caesarea Maritime, Caesarea on the sea. And then, of course, higher critics said, David never really, and this is still taught in seminaries, David never really existed. He was, a symbolic person. Well, in the city of Dan, they found another artifact, and it's a stone, actually, written during the Assyrian times. It talks about the house of David. The king of Assyria is dealing with David's descendants, the heirs to the throne. And so there we go. Hard archaeological evidence the house of David existed. This is found, this archaeological stone with Assyrian writing on it. I have a picture of it. The last archaeological thing, and there's plenty more. These are just like some of the top 10 archaeological finds of the past 20 years or so. Is once again High Priest Caiaphas. Not only was I in his house, well, above his house, obviously, it's an archaeological site in Jerusalem, but they found actually his bone box. His name is on the side, the ossuary, the bone box. The ossuary held the bones of a 60-year-old male, and it's housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And on the side it says, Joseph, son of Caiaphas, known as the High Priest Caiaphas in the New Testament. And so scholars once argued against his existence, but they actually have the box with his bones now that was recovered. So how much more evidence do you need, people?
Yeah, no, this is a great final third punch to the combo here, if you will. It's just there's a lot of evidence, and people like to question stuff. But yeah, I don't have much to add to this. I have some other things I want to tangent off on from your other experiences. But Trace, do you have anything else? And then Colonel, go ahead and chime in. Any final thoughts on your third leg?
I feel like the only thing we really need that even then, if we find like the Ark of the Covenant or Noah's Ark or something huge like that, there's still going to be people that are going to try to argue against it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to the Bible, there's just a huge stigma around it. Just like, I hate to compare the two, but just like cryptozoology and stuff, there's a huge stigma around that. If you're a well-regarded scientist in some field and you suddenly start to study UFOs,
or
you're
Bigfoot.
Done for. Yeah, you're done. So I think it's kind of, it's a little more respectable than those, but it's still like the same kind of thing. It's just a huge stigma around it.
Yeah. Well, like you see there's at least claims of slanted evidence, like in the Skinwalker Ranch book, talks about how they would take, this is a claim by a scientist, I think they would do like surgery cuts on like an actual cow, and they would send it into this lab that was supposedly doing analysis for like cattle mutilations, but they did their own surgical cuts, like they did surgery, and they sent it into the lab, and it came back as an animal attack. And it's like, okay, that seems to be indicating that there's some confirmation bias here. But that being said, Colonel, you have anything on your third leg, or should I start rapid firing into some other topics?
Yeah, let's rapid fire on other topics.
All right, give us a brief rundown of SIDE. What SIDE is, your efforts. I know we've already talked about it, but just kind of like give us your brief summary here, because we're starting to run a little low on time. Want to respect that for you.
Sergeant York Discovery Expedition. So go to side.com, sergeantyorkdiscovery.com, and you'll see pictures and narratives of our work there. So we came together in mid-2000s, 2004 or so, 2005, to get the bottom of the York story. I watched the Sergeant York movie when I was a kid in the early 70s, and was amazed by his story, but it really bothered me. He didn't want to be a hero, didn't want to be in the Army. He wasn't like John Wayne, he's like this anti-hero. And so, but as an officer in the Army, leadership manuals even today feature Sergeant York as a soldier that we need to emulate. Extols his virtue, his integrity, and even his religious beliefs, even though we're like in a post-Christian society in the government, and the military these days. And so I used to teach about him when I was a company commander. Even had a mural of him and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain from the Gettysburg Battle, little round top painted on the walls in my headquarters building. But then I started reading about detractors. We don't think it really happened. You know, the story goes that Sergeant York, conscience objector, went into war willing to die for his country, not kill for his country. 8 October 1918, the attack into the Argonne Forest, trying to save the Lost Battalion. A large group of Americans trapped on the opposite side of the Argonne Forest for 5 days, needing relief. So the 82nd Division, part of which York was a member of, attacked into the eastern part of the Argonne to try to relieve pressure from the Lost Battalion. It worked, actually. The night before, the Germans had to withdraw because of the attack that was impending. They saw the 82nd coming up the Meuse Valley. And as the Americans attacked, the Germans had a fire zone set up to death zone, fire zone to kill the Americans. They had 4 regiments poised to let the Americans into this valley and slaughter them. The American attack faltered pretty quickly on 8 October in the morning. Sergeant York and 16 other Americans were told to try to find a way through. They found a way through. Just to get the bottom line, in the end, Sergeant York's going to be the last non-commissioned officer of the 17, either not killed or wounded. He's going to lead the survivors against the Germans. He'll single-handedly run up the hill, take out the German machine gun position, which you and your mom found on our first visit there in 2002. And then it would walk out with 132 prisoners of war.
It's a wild story. And again, detractors came in to question, even though it happened at the time about 80, 90 years ago. And so, yeah, that bothered you as well. And you wanted to set out and find what really happened.
Yeah, so, and there was another group out there, and I offered to collaborate with them. Thankfully, they declined because they were working off of a bias, just the American sources. So that put them about 600 meters away from the actual site. And so I spent a lot of time going through the German archives. The German Empire then was broken down in 4 kingdoms. And, one of the kingdoms, of course, was Prussia. One was Saxony. One was Bavaria. And the last one was Baden-Württemberg. Well, Württemberg. Baden came in later, but the Württembergish Empire. And that's southwestern Germany. And so I went to the Baden-Württemberg archives now. That's a new name since World War II. And guess what? It looked like no one had touched those for about 100 years of records. When I went down there, they were tied up in string. They're covered in dust when I got these. And guess what? The Germans actually pinpoint the site. So we went to where the Germans and the Americans described the Germans being on the defensive more accurate. They actually had an X on a map. And so that's where we began our research. And that's how we uncovered these artifacts that lined up with the whole layout of the story from the German and American perspective.
And so that's interesting because then it shows that accounts can still be true, but still slightly off in their details sometimes. And that's important to keep in mind when looking at history as a whole. So do you have anything else that you want to add on side as a whole to kind of give the rundown on like your research and the archaeology aspect of it? Or is that
so, in a lot of ways, it was a groundbreaking approach. It's not unique, but I think the way we combined the research was very scientific and modern. And as a result, that first book won 4 awards because it was pretty, earth-shaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first approach was, of course, going through the historical documents, and then next the archaeology, and then layering that with my experience as a military officer. And one of my master's degrees, basically in the art of war, military operational art and science. And so looking at the terrain as a soldier would, even in 1918, it's the same as today, actually. And looking at the laydown and deployments of the regiments, and, where would this have happened? And York describes certain regiments he captured men from. At least the unit described these units. And so where were these units located? And then going out there with metal detectors, with the approval, as you said, with the local authorities. They were the ones that mattered. And, the mayor, the mayors are very powerful out there. It's communal land. It's city land. And finding the archaeological evidence, mapping it, and then going a step further with ballistic analysis, having a world-renowned ballistic scientist to look at these artifacts. And it all lined up that this was York. And guess what? Just about everything that's in the account that we saw in the movie is true.
So you are definitely on the forerunning aspect of proving, well, at least maybe not necessarily proving, but just conducting a fair, objective analysis of historical accounts where detractors are coming in and trying to poke holes and asking questions. You by far, like you said, are not the only individual doing this. It's not a new methodology, but it's definitely rare to see. And it's good research. I mean, I might be biased, but I think that it's pretty flawless in how you combined all of the approaches together. So it adds up quite nicely. Trace, what do you think about all this?
I mean, it's just cool. I'm not really knowledgeable in archaeology and stuff, so I can't really add to this much.
That's fair. So we're wrapping up our conversation on the Bible. So let's broaden our sights here a little bit, Colonel. What are your thoughts on how should we look at mythology? Things like the Iliad, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Atlantis. How would you, as a academic, someone that has a PhD in this subject, so now it's not your specific focus, but you are still far more familiar with it than I'd say 95% of the population is, at least. But all of these topics of myth, as we're about to shift gears in the podcast after our UFO conversation and start exploring Norse, Sumerian, Greek, the idea of Atlantis, how would you recommend approaching these from that academic perspective? What insights would you have to offer? Do you think it's even worth exploring and trying to find this mythical matrix tied under the surface?
I do believe it's worth exploring. I do believe that we shouldn't discount it because at this moment of time, there's no archaeological evidence. Because as I already discussed, for 1,000 years, people believe Babylon didn't exist because when it was conquered, by later empires, it was razed to the ground basically, and then it took, of course, the British Army in World War I going through there and having a bunch of bored soldiers and an officer with a vision, digging, and guess what? We found Babylon, and it's indisputable. Babylon did thanks to that dig. Pontius Pilate's existence was because of an archaeological find. That the Roman historian Talus in 55 AD mentioning Troy, just as an aside, kind of like how he mentioned as an aside Jesus and what happened the day Jesus died. Just an aside, not even part of the work, but it mentioned Troy, and for thousands of years until late 1800s, was early 1900s, late 1800s. The archaeologists went out there, and he mentioned the fall of Troy, and for many years people said, "Oh, it's myth because we don't have any evidence." Well, maybe you don't have the evidence now, but it might be out there.
So we should be careful to dismiss this stuff out of hand and not necessarily take it as proof because it's in myth, but use that as grounds for more research.
Yeah, and stay in a library as long as you need to, and as you already said, then there's a time when you get out of the library and start looking.
Well, it's Dr. Henry Jones said, not me. I just quoted him. All right, last question for you here. So we're going to shift gears a little bit after we kind of broaden this perspective. So this kind of pulls us out of our interlinear kind of season one-ish kind of vibe here where we did a deep analysis of the Bible. We still have to finish up some stuff with Harrison Smith. The last big question for you here, Colonel. Desert Storm experience. You have some interesting stories there, and that plays in more to the mystery aspect, I would say, than the your academic credentials. This is definitely something more anecdotal, but you are a very highly credentialed individual. So for the things that you saw over there beyond just the warfare itself are pretty wild. But I'll leave that for you to share with us. I want to hear that the stories and experiences in their entirety here to fuel that conversation of mystery.
So Desert Shield began on 2nd August 1990 after Saddam Hussein invaded and occupied Kuwait because he owed them $4 or $5 billion in oil revenues because of his Iran-Iraq war. He couldn't afford, and he accused the Kuwaitis of stealing oil from him with slant drilling, whatever. And the lack of clarity from the American ambassador, Abel Gillespie, led him to believe it'd be low risk to take over Kuwait and actually, have about a third of the reserves of oil at the time at his fingertips. He could control the world economy. Massive power. The United States, under George Herbert Walker Bush, said this will not stand. We're going to draw a line in the sand. And Desert Shield began the deployment of Army assets, Air Force assets, Marines, and Navy assets to the region to first defend Saudi Arabia. All indications were he was going to continue to eastern Saudi Arabia to have more than a third of the oil reserves of the world at his fingertips and control the world economy. That would make him, pretty irresistible globally. And our forces built up initially to defend Saudi Arabia, and then it was decided on November 14th of 1990, Dick Cheney, our Secretary of Defense, got on TV and announced that most of 7th Corps out of Germany, 7th Armored Corps, we were fitted and trained to fight the Soviet Union to defend Germany. We're going to come down with thousands of tanks and become the offensive force. And so I arrived in Saudi Arabia, east in Dhahran, on 7 December 1990. Forces continued to arrive so we can go on the attack. Massive iron fists of tanks trained for Cold War fighting against the Iraqis. But Saddam Hussein had a trick up his sleeve, which we knew about: chemical weapons. He'd use chemical weapons against the Iranians extensively, mustard gas, poisonous gas. You see pictures of Iranians, giant blisters over there, blister agents. You drown your own blood because your lungs will blister with this chemical. And he used it on his own people in northern Iraq, the Kurdish people, very independently minded people. They're not Arabs, they're a separate tribe. And so we knew he was going to use chemical weapons. And to come to find out, my unit was going to lead the main attack. So we actually entered the ground war a day before the ground war began. We were in Iraq the night before the 23rd. So at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we entered Iraq the day before the ground war. So anyway, we knew he was going to use chemicals. His division commanders were told to use chemical weapons on the Americans in Iraq. Not necessarily Kuwait, but definitely in Iraq. And so we were going into Iraq to outflank his armored forces. And the biggest thing favoring the use of chemical weapons was the wind blows normally from Iraq into Saudi Arabia. So it blows from the north in a southerly direction. And I had identified some Iraqi positions in front of me, so we sent in some, we coordinated for A-10s to come in to take out the Iraqi positions, and followed up by multiple launch rocket systems firing blasts to eliminate the Iraqis in front of us. And then our engineers went forward, who essay on, went through and cut holes in the berms, and we started launching forward into Iraq. As our first tank, I'm standing there watching this happen. The wind is blowing in my face. I'm looking north towards Iraq. The wind is favoring chemical weapons. As our first Abram tanks crosses from Saudi Arabia into Iraq, I see hundreds, if not thousands, of dust devils forming all around me. So all these little, dust tornadoes around me. I'm like, that's really weird. And before my eyes, thanks to those dust devils, I watched the wind shift from its normal course from the northeast to the southwest to the complete opposite direction. What's the so what? So the wind is now at our back. So Saddam Hussein uses tactical chemical weapons on us. It's going to blow right back on his own troops. It's like when you're spraying for bugs in the garden. You want to, have the wind at your back. Otherwise, you get the nerve agent in your face. And so because of that, Saddam Hussein could not use chemical weapons on us. Otherwise, he'd kill his own troops. So that was the biggest divine intervention I've ever seen in my life. When I realized, because I was the intel officer, I was Red Catcher 2. You could see the Cold War nomenclature there. My fixed call sign was Red Catcher 2. We catch Reds, communists, coming out of the Czechoslovakian East German border. And I was always briefing the men. It was all male unit at the time, the dangers of chemical weapons. And Saddam was going to use them. And, he used them already. He's going to use them on us. And he could not. And as I realized the gravity of this here, that this was God's intervention, I felt very small in that moment. And the wind stayed in that direction over the battlefield until the exact minute the ceasefire went into effect on the 28th of February, 1991 at 8 o'clock in the morning. Then everything went back to normal. I saw it.
That's wild. Anecdotal, Trace. Any problems with anecdotes?
No. It's just when you just look at anecdotes and some things.
Well, of course. But you have to look at the bigger picture. But it's a very, very wild coincidence. It's so wild it can't be a coincidence.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That's a mystery aspect there. Could you tell us the helicopter one as well?
Yeah, so on the 27th of February, trying to get my dates right here.
It's 30 years after the fact. He might get some of his dates slightly wrong since it wasn't written or told that close to the event.
26th of February, we began the big tank battle against the Iraqi Republican Guards. I call them the bad Republicans. And then these guys, they knew we didn't. There's a lot of urban legend out there. We didn't surprise them. We didn't sneak up on. They knew we were coming. They felt the earth shaking. We captured one general. He goes, when 7th Corps attacked, which I was part of, the 2nd Cavalry, the eyes and ears of 7th Corps out of Germany, because when 7th Corps attacked, the earth shook. They knew we were coming. There's thousands of tanks and armored vehicles coming against your position. And so even though they were blinded, they didn't have good intel, we blinded them that way. They could feel the earth shaking. They're waiting for us to come. And we're going forward, and Air Force F-16s are picking off Iraqi tanks, that are dug in, onesies and twosies, but there's hundreds. It's not going to help. And as my squadron is forward, I was 4th Squadron, the helicopter squadron, we're doing a battle handover. We got to get out of the way because our guys will get shot down in this mix of American and Iraqi rounds going back and forth. So we're doing a battle handover. The minute 4th Squadron peels off, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, all the squadrons are in attack. There's only a small reserve, one troop of Cobras in reserve. We have nothing else. All 3 squadrons of tanks and Bradleys are going to we hand over the battle to them. And as the tank battles about to begin, we're advancing. The Iraqis are waiting. We see them. They're coming. A shamal, a sandstorm mixed with rain and thunderstorm and sand, blinds them on the battlefield. We're able to see through the silicone in the air and the moisture as well, and we're able to blow through this unit outnumbered as 5-1, thanks to the perfect timing once again.
Last one, and then I'll let you go here, is tell us about the helicopter crash.
So Yeah, a couple of things on helicopters. So during the Air Force did 1,000 hours of bombardment, and they did a great job preparing the battlefield for us here. The Air Forces includes Marine, Naval, and NATO allied, Saudi and others. But one morning I was woken up. I heard one of our Cobras go off on an early morning mission. It was like 5 or 6 in the morning. It was pitch black out. It's dead of the winter down there, so it gets dark like up here. And I hear it stalling. It's about 100 feet above ground level. Sputter, sputter, sputter. Boom. Crashes into the ground, explodes, rockets, fully combat loaded, fully fueled rockets, tow missiles are popping off. The cannon is shooting off rounds as rounds are exploding. And I'm about a quarter mile away. I have a clear view. I have pictures of the fireball. I'm praying, God, please save those 2 men. The Cobra has 2 operators. But I'm like thinking, there's no way they could. There's no ejection seat.
Yeah. So for those of our listeners that aren't familiar, the Cobra attack helicopters was used up into the late 90s, I believe. And you have it's similar to the Apache attack helicopter, whereas both pilot and co-pilot sit directly underneath the main blades of the helicopter. There are no side doors. The blades have to be completely stopped, or you have to eject so fast that you would eject through the blades faster than the blades would spin, which is physically impossible to do safely, at least with technology of the 90s. So by all means and methodology of laws of physics, these pilots died, right?
That's what I was thinking, even though I was praying for God's deliverance. And so, but they survived. And I was speaking to one of the chief warrant officers.
Okay, so hold up here. When you say they survived, do you mean that they were like, bandaged up in the hospital in like full body casts?
I said, Chief, how did you get out of the helicopter alive? He goes, sir, I have no idea. 1 minute we're crashing. The next minute, me and the gunner are standing outside the helicopter, kind of like in a trance. We came to ourselves, saw the explosion next to us, and ran.
So let me get this straight. They didn't have a scratch from the crash.
Not a scratch.
Not a scratch. They were out. They weren't just, you didn't go see him in the hospital or anything. You just saw him in passing, walking around like nothing had ever happened.
They were perfectly in 100% shape. And they had no idea how they survived it or how they got out. They had no clue.
It's quite a mystery here on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Well, thank you very much, Colonel Dr. Doug Mastriano, for your time and for tuning in with us for these 2 episodes here. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. We'll let you carry on. For those of our listeners, we will be right back after this short ad break.
All right. I'm still trying to process the story, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild one, that's for sure. So it's hard to deny too, where if it was just random Joe Schmo that said something like that, that'd be one thing, but it's the credentials as well that. Whoops. That was my bad. That was a very abrupt ending there. I bumped the wires and it disconnected stuff. So we are back for a second time now. So yeah, anyway, as I was saying, it's hard to dismiss the claim from such a credentialed individual with a PhD, 4 masters, a retired colonel, active duty with 30 years experience, 4 combat deployments.
Yeah, there's no reason to make it up with those credentials.
No, absolutely not.
It's the same thing as like the data list from the whale episode. And
exactly.
That kind of stuff.
Exactly. And so you're faced with all of these claims about things about the world. And this is why people of science will look at, the spiritual things happening on the mystery side and they'll scoff at it and be like, oh, this is all just made up. We can't quantify this. Well, sometimes the universe supersedes our ability to conduct experimentation. And that's why people believe things beyond our universe, I think. Mm-hmm. That being said here, I'm going to finish up with one final thought. I wanted to get the Colonel's perspective on this, but in the interest of time, since we ran long, we ended a little early with him. I'm going to talk about one last thing. I'm going to kick it over to Trace for our creature fact, and we're going to end the show. Okay. And the episode. We're not ending the show. We will be back next week with more fantastic content. Now, hopefully UFOs.
I feel like we should break this up into like seasons or something.
I kind of already have that direction where this is close to the end of season 1. The UFO subject is going to lead us into season 2.
Gotcha. Okay.
That is the plan, but we'll see how that works in execution. So there's a supposed contradiction in the Bible, Trace, and there are supposed hundreds of these, but I want to discuss one in particular because I've seen, again, reasoned reality, more like the logical fallacies account, discussing one in particular, and they won't let it go. So I'm going to talk about it on here. So it's about how Judas died. So I'm going to read from Matthew 27, 3 through 10 from the NIV on BibleGateway.com. When Judas, who had betrayed him, referring to Jesus, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. So here we have a clear account in the Gospel of Matthew outlining Judas's death. Let's contrast that to something that Acts says. Acts 1:18. With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong. His body burst open, and all of his explicit warning intestines spilled out. So here you have two seeming contradictions. Trace, what do you make of this?
I mean, it seems like two different things. He jumped off, splatted on the ground, or he hung himself.
So I've been to this region of Israel. I don't have great memory of it because it was like well over a decade ago.
Yeah.
But this region of Israel, the Field of Blood, is a rocky area. So what was somewhat common for people of the day is that they would find a small cliff that had a tree growing over the edge of it, and they would tie a noose around their neck, and they'd throw the other end of the noose around a tree branch that was hanging over the cliff, and they'd jump off the cliff and unalive themselves that way. So in actuality here, this is how eyewitness accounts work, Trace, is we don't get all the details of what happened looking at just one account. We get the details by the collective whole. So here we have Judas is filled with remorse, and he goes and he hangs himself by throwing himself over a cliff with a noose tied around his neck. So then how do we know about his intestines being spilled out? So Luke, who is the author of both the Gospel of Luke and Acts. Gospel of Luke does not have an account of Judas's death, by the way. It's only Acts that gives us this account from Luke's perspective. He went and conducted eyewitness research, interviewed people. What he found was this claim here in his interviews. So what happened is people were walking by and they look and they say, oh, Judas fell into a canyon and he died. So by any number of natural processes, it's very easy for a body to decompose. That's a very hot region, Israel. I was there in February. They had a snowfall there. It was like a light dusting that was gone by noon. People were excited. They weren't driving. They were treating it like a freak storm. I think it was the first time in like 10 or 20 years it had even snowed. So it's a very hot region of the world. And this is in the winter in February. And it's just above the equator, I believe. It's not like on the equator. It's just above. I could be slightly off on that. But yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that there could be any number of explanations for these accounts to be synergized, and we can't just dismiss it out of hand because they just read on the surface level of being different. This is how eyewitness accounts are known by detectives to not necessarily be just reliable in and of themselves to tell the whole story. Detectives, when they're doing research, they'll go interview multiple witnesses, and they'll take all of these accounts together and they'll put them all together to get the big picture of what happened. And so that's what you have to do here when you're analyzing these two supposedly contradictory accounts. And when you look at it, Matthew says that the Pharisees went out and bought the field. Acts tells us that Judas went out and bought the field. You can glean here as well that the Pharisees bought it under Judas's name because that's where he killed himself. So they went out and bought that specific field. I'm not just making stuff up to fit the narrative here, but it doesn't take a lot of work to do this, to think and understand the geography of the region, to understand how eyewitness accounts works, and how Trace and I might go out and observe the same phenomenon and have two very different takes. But you can take both of our takes and you can understand what is being said as a whole. And so I want to say this, I wanted to get the Colonel's thoughts on this, but for lack of time, we didn't. Be careful jumping to conclusions and saying, "Ooh, these are clear contradictions." Well, no, they're not. This is how stuff works in history and eyewitness accounts. It's not always black and white, clear cut and dry. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of critical thinking.
But even from the two accounts, it still seems like it's a definite, like, okay, he died from hanging, and then the other one is he died from jumping off a cliff and hitting the ground. So I could totally see the story of, like, okay, maybe he hung himself, and then later on the rope gave out or something and he fell. But it just seems like a clear, like, here's how he died.
So the Greek word is from Strong's Interlinear on Bible Hub, genominos, which is for falling, referring to, let's look into this a little bit more real quick. Say something smart, Trace.
It's still, I don't know. Like, I understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, it still does seem
all it says is it fell. It basically, what the effect of the Greek word here is that if he fell headlong, like that he just fell, and he fell and he landed on his stomach and his intestines spilled out, which would be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he threw himself off of the cliff and that he immediately hit the ground thereafter. He jumped off the cliff and fell until the noose caught his neck, and according to Matthew, and then he fell and his body splatted eventually.
I could see that.
Yeah, and so this isn't. You can argue this either way, but you can't argue my claim is an absolute proof because it's eyewitness accounts. It's highly likely using methodology that detectives would use to piece these eyewitness accounts together and say this is likely what happened. Either just the natural swelling and heat, of his body caused the body to fall and burst open, or scavengers like why can't I think of the word? Vultures, thank you. Vultures came along and picked away and loosened his body from the noose. It could be any number of explanations. I can't say for certain that this is absolutely true, but to dismiss all of these just because they're seemingly contradictions on a surface level is disingenuous. Now, you can't use this as an absolute proof either, but I'd actually be more concerned if they said the exact same wording, exact same thing, because then that would say that they copied it from the same source versus they have seeming contradictions that actually give us a bigger picture of the region of the area and everything else that's going on. All of the pieces of the puzzle start to connect together, and it's more likely this is an explanation than it isn't an explanation. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be careful. And I want to apply this broader, Trace. Let's keep this principle in mind that we're analyzing here with all myth. Let's kind of set this precedent a little bit, that we have to be careful when we see things that seem like contradictions. They might not actually be contradictions. They might just seem to be contradictions from our limited perspective. Yeah. So that being said, unless you have any interjections there, we'll wrap up the show with your creature fact.
All right. So this is a story that I heard off of another podcast from someone in Alaska. I'll have to find the area that it's in because I want to do an episode on the area later because there's supposedly a lot of like sea monster sightings there. But this particular one, there was a group of, I think, students that were out, and they snuck. It was like a school trip. So after everyone else went to bed, they kind of like snuck up onto the deck to like just hang out.
As kids do.
Yeah. The person said that they were all sober. So that's important.
No boy.
So they were, a pot of orcas came up, and that's cool in itself, but they could see, these huge fins and stuff coming up out of the water, and then they left. And then a little while later, this other one came up, but then it was a lot taller than the other fins. And it also looked a little more like battle worn. And then there was another one that came up, and another one, and another one. And they all were in this like line that it seemed like there were these spikes alongside of a giant sea monster. So what do you... And they just, like, there were multiple people that witnessed this. They all... the person said that they all were like, we all just saw that, right? And then they even like confirmed it a few years later. That's like, yeah, we saw that.
So did all the eyewitness statements generally agree that it was like a sea monster? What were there different statements?
They all,
let's apply the methodology here we just talked about.
I only heard from, this is like a third hand telling, because I heard this podcast talk about like this person messaged in and they told their story. But it sounds like they all kind of collaborate the same thing, that they all saw like these big spikes come up, and it seemed to be chasing this pod of killer whales, which killer whales are like the apex species. Nothing messes with a killer whale. So,
well, we talked about too how there was likely a bigger predator because of the population of one of the whale sizes on the previous episode, right? Like there was a potential for something because of a lower population.
I think I was arguing
I suggested that you were talking about the population size, and you said that one was surprisingly low in comparison.
Oh, the humpback whales.
Yeah, and I suggested that hey, maybe there's a natural predator or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. So, I mean, this is also in an area where there are supposedly a few sightings. So I'm gonna have to go back and see if I can find that again, because I want to dig into it a little more.
And we'll definitely have some sea monster episodes in the future.
Yes.
Episodes, plural. All right.
That's done.
That's it. All right, we're done.
That's a wrap.
All right, well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Mystery Seekers, Musers, for tuning in to this episode. You can get a hold of us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. You can find us on Facebook, the Book of Faces, on Musings on Mysteries, and the Mythical Matrix -M Quad. And there you can find that one episode that we streamed live, although it is the previous episode, so you can already go listen to it on Spotify, YouTube, all your other podcasting platforms. So there isn't, I guess...
You get the little ad breaks in between it, too.
Yeah. You get a little snippet of what we do on the ad break. So I guess that's worth it if you're that dedicated to the show. So you can interact with us on any of those platforms. Please send us your confessions, contentions, snide remarks, whatever you have to offer about the show. We invite you to quantumly transcend time and interact with us, as this is an ongoing conversation. And I hope to circle back to some of these topics in the near future because of listener communications. So don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. So whether you're listening on the earth, above the earth, or below the earth, we thank you for tuning in this fine evening, and we invite you to have a good night.
Toodles.